Hi, this video is titled, What is a Force? It's based upon Young and Freedman's University Physics textbook, Chapter 4. It covers both the introduction and the first section of that chapter. However, any physics book is going to come to forces fairly quickly. In this chapter, we move from a subject called kinematics to a subject called dynamics. Kinematics is basically a description of motion. So the chapters thus far in university physics have dealt with motion in one dimension, motion in 2 and 3 dimensions, and so forth. We've talked about circular motion, we've talked about projectile motion, and so forth, straight line motion. That's all kinematics. It's the description of motion. This chapter, in any book, is going to switch from a description of motion to what's called dynamics. Dynamics has to do with why bodies move the way they do. Of course, from the philosophy of science, we're not really explaining why. We're just getting more precise myths, as it were, more precise expressions of reality. God's the only one that knows why these things do the way they do, if even that's a meaningful question. But that's another class. That's a philosophy class. For a popular everyday language, let's say that dynamics begins to get into the why things move the way that they do. So enter the concept of force, the push and the pull on things. And also enter into the discussion mass, things that occupy space. So we haven't really talked about force or mass thus far in your typical physics textbook. We've just tried to describe motion. Now we're going to try to get into a myth, as it were. Let me tell you a story that will help you be able to explain why things do the way they do, or better yet, let's not say explain, let's say predict how things are going to behave under certain circumstances. So this is a chapter, this chapter enters into Newton's 3 laws of motion. Sir Isaac Newton lived in the 1600s. He was a very smart guy. I hate him even though he's dead. Just incredibly brilliant mind that just drives me nuts. His 3 laws of motion in this chapter are basically, 1, a body in motion tends to stay in motion, or a body at rest tends to stay at rest. Galileo came up with it before him, but we can call it Newton's first law of motion. The second one is that force equals mass times acceleration, F equals ma. There are other versions of that. And then lastly, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Those are Newton's 3 laws of motions. And these are called the classical, this is the foundation for classical mechanics, as it were, Newtonian mechanics. Of course, Einstein had to come along about 100 years ago and just ruin everything. We find that Newton's mechanics don't work when you're approaching the speed of light or when you're near a black hole or a very, very large object. But that's not important right now. In this, we just want to lay the groundwork for Newton's 3 laws. The next video will be about Newton's first law. So what is a force? In a popular sense, Young and Freedman tell us it's a push or a pull. A force pushes stuff, or a force pulls stuff. I think that's really helpful. That's really nice and easy. A force is a push or a pull. Now there are some contact forces, and then there are long-range forces. This is not hard again. A contact force is a force that exerts itself by contact, or at least from our perspective it looks like contact. So here are the 3 main contact forces, or the 3 kind of everyday contact forces. There's what's called the normal force. It's actually, most of us don't think of the normal force as a force. But when I step on the floor steps back up on me. So the normal force is basically a structure pushing back up on me when I'm standing on it or when I'm pushing on it. If I push on the wall, the normal force is the force from the wall on my hand. I don't usually think of that as a force, but we do call that a force, the normal force. Friction force I'm used to. And you ever get rug burn? That's a friction force. And you get an abrasion, fall off your bike, skid, scrape your elbow, that's a friction force, or the remnant, or the effect of a friction force. And then, of course, there's a tension force. Like if you're playing tug of war, pulling on something, that's a tension pulling kind of force. So those are the 3 kind of main contact forces, visions of things to come in physics. The unit of force is the Newton. named after, surprisingly, Newton. It's like kilogram meters per second squared, that kind of thing. But just put a bookmark there. We'll come back to it later. Then there are long-range forces, which include things like gravity and electromagnetism and so forth. I think ultimately everything is a long-range force, but forget I said that. For now, let's just say there are contact forces and there are long-range forces. Okay, the last thing in this section, the first section of Chapter 4, is the idea of the superposition of forces. All that means is adding forces to each other. Young and Freedman put it nice and crisply. All the forces, basically, at any one point, let's say you have 10 different forces on a particular point, which would be very unusual, but let's go with it. That basically, the effect of 10 different forces, or 5 forces, or 3 forces, the effect of multiple forces at any point on a body is the same as if you added up the vector sum of all those forces and combined them together. The net force, or if to use summation notation, the sum of the vector force is a vector, it has a direction, the vector force, the sum of all those forces, the net force, it's the same. So basically, if you take all the forces on a body at a point and add them all up and replace them with a single vector sum resultant force, it's going to be the same effect. There you have it, the superposition of forces. Of course, what this means is also that we can break down a vector force into its component parts. Its x component, its y component, its z component. It's all going to be the same. We can break down a net force into its component vectors, and we're not changing it. We're just describing it in a different way. Or we can take if we have the component forces, we can use the Pythagorean theorem to square all the individual components, add them together, and take the square root of it, and that will give us the net resultant force. So that also works the opposite direction. And of course, we can find the angle by using trig. It's the old something we've talked about in previous videos, that the tangent of this divided by this, the tangent of this angle of a right triangle, is the opposite over the adjacent side. So just take your calculator and then do the arctangent, the inverse tangent of that ratio, and whoop, it'll tell you what angle measure that angle has. Hopefully you know that if you've come this far in a physics course. If not, check other videos on trig stuff. This has been the beginning of forces, and a force is a push or a pull. There you have it.